being a white middle class person in a place like Australia, I don't have a lot of first-hand experiences of racism. But certainly I remember walking down a street in Shanghai many years ago when I was travelling around China, and a young child kind of stopped in the middle of the street and looked at me, pointed and said, "Koala." And it wasn't so much the word, meaning devil, that put me off. It was the look of fear and suspicion in the child's eyes, that here I was, an outsider, and somebody to be worried about, to be scared of, to be suspicious of. And you know, I kind of felt a bit put out, because I thought I was one of the good guys. You know, I'm not doing anything bad, I'm not being a problem, but he was a child coming armed with a whole range of perceptions of people who were different to him, and it was just an automatic response on his part. So that was kind of an interesting moment for me, and it wasn't the first moment I had in China or in other parts of Asia where people were just amazed by, surprised by, and suspicious of my difference. Racism is a very difficult term to define, not only because it's very politically sensitive, and people use it as a kind of a term of abuse to make judgments about people, but also because it involves lots of very complex cultural and ethnic and factors around language and faith. The important thing to bear about the category of racism is that race, of course, is not a biological category. We tend to think of race as being scientifically proven to be biological categories, but all the research shows that, in fact, it's the social perceptions of physical differences that underlie common understandings of race. And similarly too with notions of ethnicity and culture and so on and so forth. But racism therefore becomes not so much a response to the given biological differences of people, but the way social perceptions around questions of race, culture and ethnicity play out. So it's a difficult term, but a very important one, and we're grappling a lot with the term racism at the moment, because what we've seen in the last decade or so is the question of racism related to questions of religion. So we're kind of trying to work out ways in which to understand the idea of racism in much more nuanced and sophisticated ways. So when we talk about questions of race and ethnicity and culture, we're talking about social constructions or social perceptions of differences between people. And racism there, it covers a whole range of things in relationship to those perceptions of difference. They involve attitudes about the differences between people, but they also involve the practices that people engage in, which are about acting upon those perceptions. So you don't have to say anything to engage in a racist action. You can just go up to somebody and tear their hijab off. At the same time, you can make offensive comments about somebody without necessarily doing anything to them. So when we talk about racism, we're actually talking about a range of actions. And it's important to kind of bear in mind that we're not just talking about a single category here.
Australia has undoubtedly a racist past. To what extent does this exist today in contemporary society?
Well, it's very clear that racism is not simply a question of Australia's past, but is an ongoing part of its present and will continue into its future. That's partly because the settlement of Australia as a kind of a frontier colonial country was predicated on the disposition of an existing group of people. So it was predicated on the unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunities between two groups of people. But Australia is also a migrant nation. It's been since the first arrival of Europeans over 200 years ago. It's existed and grown because of its migrant population. But most of that, of course, has been English-speaking background. But since the middle of the 19th century, when large numbers of Chinese migrants arrived during the gold rushes, there's been a fairly constant flow of people from different cultural backgrounds, different language backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And certainly in the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War, that array of people from different countries increased dramatically, coming from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and from the Middle East and from parts of Asia. So Australia has been the site of a very remarkable social experiment. It has the widest array of migrants in the world, and it has the highest proportion of people of migrant backgrounds in the world. And yet we don't have the history of conflict that you see in the UK or in the US. We don't have a history of the riots in Los Angeles. in London and in Leeds and in Brixton and Bradford in the UK. We don't have the history of the riots in France that have occurred for many, many years. We do have the Cronulla riots, but some people would point out that the Cronulla riots are interesting because they're unusual in Australia's history.
In Australia today, whom do you think racist attitude is mostly directed at? And do you think that the media plays a contributing factor to this?
Certainly in the last decade or so, the work that I've done has focused on the way the experiences of racism have increased, particularly for people of Middle Eastern, Arabic, Lebanese and Muslim backgrounds. So in the 1980s and 90s, whereas a lot of racism was directed towards people of Asian backgrounds, there was a shift that took place in the 1990s, so that more of those attitudes, more of those behaviours were directed towards people of the Middle East. And I think the media has a very crucial role in the encouragement of racist attitudes. We can see that very particularly, for example, in the Cronulla riots. In the lead up to the Cronulla riots, talkback radio, certain parts of the press were involved in beating up the stories about gangs of Lebanese boys attacking people of Australian background and so on, and encouraging kind of an atmosphere of fear and panic and anxiety. But racism is not the attribute of one group, and it's not just directed to another group. I see in my own work all sorts of people can engage in racist attitudes and behaviours. Some of the people who are victims of racism can also be the perpetrators of racism. Doesn't mean that only one group, such as English-speaking background Australians, are the sole source of racism in Australia. One of the central features of racism of any sort is the way that we turn people who are different to us, whether physically or culturally or whatever, into things, what you termed objectification. We turn cultures, for want of a better phrase, into objects. Okay? We talk about Lebanese culture, we talk about Muslims, we talk about Asians. So what we do is turning people or whole cultures into things. And of course, that's not reality. In reality, people are very complex beings, either because of experiences of intermarriage or because they're second generation. We actually participate in a whole range of different types of cultural backgrounds, irrespective of our physical differences. But objectification is important. It's not just that we turn people into objects, into things, and their cultures into things. In doing that, we turn people into representatives of those cultures. Okay? And what I mean by that is that if I see a person of Chinese background walking down the street, I see them as a representative of Chineseness, to put it that way. So we don't see them as an individual person who might have a very complex life. We see them as a representative of Chineseness. Okay? Now this is very important when we see, we have a lot of evidence to show that if some people see a person of Lebanese background walking down the street, or a black person, they'll avoid them, okay? Because they're making judgments about them on the basis of their background, okay? Which is based on the assumptions they have about the thing that they think is their racial or their cultural background. So it's not just objectification in that we're turning cultures into things, or that we're seeing people as representatives of those things, but we use the thing-like nature of culture, the objectified version of culture, as a way of explaining people's behaviour. So when we say things like Asians are bad drivers, okay, or Chinese are good at maths, or Aborigines are lazy, or Anglos don't look after their family, or Indians are rude, when we make statements like that, what we're doing is making an assumption that their culture is a single thing. Okay? So we're kind of emptying all the kind of the complexity out of a culture, all the differences that exist within a culture, and we're using it to explain the behaviour of a group of people. And we usually do it in a negative sense, although there's a whole range of racial and cultural stereotypes that we have, which are also problematic, like Chinese are good at maths, which make assumptions about the racial or the cultural background of people and use it to explain certain types of things. But we're still objectifying a culture